One of the most important factors that drives a reduction in poverty is the pace at which the economy grows. And Kenya has grown quite robustly over the past 8 to 10 years, averaging somewhere around 5.5%. And so that has trickled down and into lower poverty, roughly at about 1 percentage point reduction per year. So overall economic growth is very important for the reduction in poverty, but it's not just the overall growth, but it's also how the pie, so to speak, is distributed amongst who is the one benefiting from that growth. When we look at Kenya's growth compared to, say, other countries, for a 1 percentage point increase in GDP, we see a 0.7 percentage point reduction in poverty, whereas for other countries, for example, in Uganda or Ghana, the report finds that it's in a region of about 1 or 1.1 percentage points. So this shows that, notwithstanding the gains that Kenya has made over the past decade in reducing poverty, there's certainly more scope for the increase in GDP growth to have a more pro-poor supportive component to it. In other words, for the growth to become more inclusive.
And that's what I want us to talk about, the fact that we've seen growth yet, but it's not inclusive enough when you look at lifting people living under $1.9 a day. So what kind of policies do we need? What should we focus on if we are talking about maybe increasing the rate of poverty reduction in the country as we head towards 2030?
Again, higher growth is always good. So 5.5 has resulted in this, but one could grow even faster. But beyond the overall aggregate economic growth, we can know that one of the things the report looks at is also the different sectors of the economy, agriculture, industry, and services, to find out which areas have the greater impact in terms of reducing poverty. And we do see that growth in the agricultural sector contributes most to reduction in poverty. So it shows that if we're able to increase productivity in the agricultural sector, that certainly will help to bring many more people out of poverty than in, say, other sectors of the economy. But it's a very complicated topic, and so there are many more factors that one could consider in order to reduce poverty.
And agriculture being among one of them. So the question is, we have a Vision 2030 as a country. And at that time, we are envisioning that we could have a significantly lower portion of the population living below the poverty line, let's say maybe below 5%. Are we going to achieve this at this rate that we've seen going by this block of 10 years whose data you've given us?
No, the report finds out that it would not, at this pace of reduction in poverty that Kenya has experienced over the past 10 years, if that continues, poverty will not be eradicated, say, by 2030. It will take many more years before that would occur. But it's a good thing that we find this out at this point in time, midterm, before the Vision 2030, because it challenges us to think through what can be done that this strong, robust growth that Kenya is enjoying can become more inclusive. So those are some things that policymakers will have to wrestle with. There are no easy solutions to that, but certainly it's something that policymakers can wrestle with. And I would suggest that some of the measures that are being considered are certainly within the context of the Big Four, issues to do with food security and nutrition. They're very crucial when it comes to reducing poverty. Of course, when we talk about poverty, it's not only income poverty. There are deprivations in other areas, health, education, etc. And the Big Four looks at some of these.
Okay, we'll look at the Big Four agenda of President Uhuru Kenyatta later on the interview. But for now, let's look at this year's projection, 5.5%. We are talking about a recovery from last year, and you are projecting 6.1% annual growth towards 2020. What will deliver this growth for Kenya?
Well, let's put this year's growth in context. to understand this year's growth, it's important to also understand why growth was weak last year. There were three key headwinds that affected the moderation in economic performance in 2017. We all know about the drought. We all know about the political uncertainties which affected investment, and we all know about the sluggish performance in credit growth. Those were three critical reasons. Two of those headwinds I would say, have waned or are dissipated, are no longer in the picture. We are seeing good rains this year. We're also seeing a rebound, I should say, in economic activity, or certainly in business sentiment by different market surveys. So that's out. We're still wrestling with slow private sector credit growth, so that's still a drag on the economy. But we find ourselves also in a situation from a global perspective where the global economy is humming, at a level that it hasn't been in quite some time now. And this is good for Kenya. So these are the supportive factors. But there are also some drags, as I mentioned, still sluggish private sector credit growth in the economy. And also there's fiscal consolidation that is taking place now. The government spending has been supportive of growth, certainly over the past 5 years or so. So to the extent that that pace slows down, it's going to be less of a stimulus to the economy.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about the slowdown of private sector credit growth, that we've seen that. And that has quite been attributed to the existence of interest rates capping. And you mentioned it in the report, and you are optimistic that we could see a successful repeal or review of that law. My question is, if we are not successful at repealing it or reviewing it early enough, how much impact does that have on your projections or on economic growth in general?
Yeah. So it's important to recognize that the slowdown in credit growth started well before the interest rate cap. At its height, credit was growing around 25% in 2015, thereabout. And then there's been that steady decline. When the interest rate cap came into existence in September, it was already around 4 to 5%. So it has slowed quite significantly below, say, the 10-year average of around 19%, growth. So let's just put that in context. So back to your question in terms of if it is not, our baseline assumes that the ongoing discussion that is taking place in the country among the policymakers will yield to some fruitful result and will allow for banks the flexibility to be able to lend to various borrowers at different risk premia. So we assume that, and that's inculcated in our baseline for 2018 and also for 2019 going. But if it does not happen, what does this mean? If it does not happen, it is a risk, and it's a risk that we point out. I mean, some studies have shown that for last year, the weakness in credit growth shaved off somewhere in the region of 0.4 percentage points from GDP. I think those are reasonable estimates. And certainly, if it does not happen, the backbone of the economy, which include SMEs, which have been those that have been priced out of the market as given under the current regime, will continue to be starved of credit, and that has implications not just for private sector credit growth, but also job creation and overall economic activity.
All right, let's jump to the Big Four agenda that President Uhuru Kenyatta talked about at the start of this second term. We are focusing on agriculture and food security. We are looking at affordable housing. We are looking at manufacturing and universal health coverage. And you say that we need to see public sector resources to these four areas, but at the same time in a fiscally sustainable manner. What does that mean?
Good question. So the Big Four is a very ambitious development agenda, and we are supportive of that agenda. I think it meets the ambition of a country such as Kenya. But we also understand that given the narrowing of the fiscal space at this current juncture, it is important for the fiscal stance to be consolidated. And this is reflected in the budget policy statement, reducing the deficit from 8.9 to somewhere in the region of 3% over the next 5 to 6 years or so. And that's certainly the right thing to do. So how do you achieve the big four, I guess your question is,
yes,
within the context,
Yeah.
And the report that makes a fundamental proposition in terms of how do you do that. And it comes back to the question of what is the role of the government and what is the role of the private sector. Our recommendations are to create an enabling environment where private capital will be sufficiently incentivized to pour resources into those priority areas. So that's the key. There are some things that only government can do, and there are some things that only government can do best. But there are other things that the private sector are better at doing. The government clearly cannot build 500,000 houses. That's impossible, especially within this situation. But it can create the conditions so that developers can make money, essentially, can profit from it. So the report has specific proposals. For example, if you want to put up, say, a 50 unit apartment, there are certain challenges that developers have dealing with how to subdivide the titles, etc. So we have concrete, or if you want to raise a mortgage, why can't we have standard mortgage documents rather than each one having to be customized and then the buyer having to pay more, for it. So, you can find similar recommendations also for the agricultural sector. So it's all about creating an enabling environment, because when the environment is created and the private sector recognizes that there are profit opportunities, be it in affordable housing, be it in healthcare, be it in agriculture, agro-processing, manufacturing, the money will flow there. And so we put some options on the table.
Mm-hmm. And do you have some recommendations on the revenue side? Because for as long as I can remember, we've not been meeting our revenue targets. And revenue is key if we are talking about reducing our debt to GDP, and the question of debt has become quite topical in the recent years. So what are the revenue issues that the government needs to put together right now?
Well, our own study shows that there's certainly scope for improved domestic revenue mobilization. For example, if we just take one area, which is tax exemptions that are provided, using only two tax types, the corporate income taxes and the value-added taxes, is about 5% in tax expenditures going there. The question one has to ask is, given current priorities, is it a priority to give 5% in these exemptions to the sectors that are benefiting from it? Those are some hard decisions or questions that have to be raised. 5% of GDP is a high number. It is higher than the budget for the agricultural sector, and it is higher than the budget for the health sector. So given today's priorities, those sectors that are receiving those benefits, should they still continue to receive those benefits? And I think a hard look will suggest no.
All right. So in the face of this short-term, maybe or austerity measures that need to be looked at, and also looking at the fact that government spending and public investment has been driving growth for quite a number of years now. We've seen the big infrastructure projects coming on board. But how do we anchor long-term productivity from these projects? Because they may be affected if we are going to squeeze our spending on them if they are not completed. An example, if the standard gauge railway phase 2 is not complete, then we may not see the benefits that we envision, 1.5% contribution to GDP every year.
It's a question about prioritization. The fact that the government is going to fiscally consolidate doesn't mean that it won't have a budget for development spending. It will have a budget for that. So it's a question of prioritization. Now, in our own study of the public investment management systems, we see significant scope for even fiscal savings there. You know, the projects being selected, are they the projects that have the highest rate of economic return? And how is the implementation of those projects? How are those projects being managed? What kind of feasibility studies were done? So along the whole chain, there's significant scope for improvement, which can lead to fiscal savings. So even with the same amount, in other words, with the same amount of money, one could even generate more fiscal infrastructure in the economy, and that is what underpins the productivity of the economy and therefore the long-term growth of the economy. And one of the things the report brings out is the recalibration between a slowdown in the pace of spending for on development spending vis-a-vis that of recurrent spending. I think some recalibration there could be helpful in terms of improving the quality of fiscal consolidation.